It's hard to escape that feeling, isn't it?
What feeling is that?
That nagging pull towards just one more biscuit, or the almost automatic click to buy something online.
Ah, yeah. Or scrolling endlessly through social media.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or being glued to the news feed. And then afterwards you get that familiar kind of pang of regret.
It's like we're sort of caught in these cycles.
Yeah, it feels like we're all navigating this maze of desires, and, well, sometimes they lead us places we didn't really intend to go.
That feeling, that sense of being caught, it's becoming so much more common in our modern world, isn't it? And it really gets to the heart of what we're going to unpack today.
Absolutely. So welcome everyone to the deep dive. Our mission here is pretty straightforward. You share your sources with us, and we distill the crucial knowledge, basically offering you a direct route to understanding what really matters.
And today we're diving into excerpts from Anna Lembke's book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. One of you actually sent this our way.
Right. And what makes Lembke's work so compelling, I think, is how she connects the science of desire, how our brains actually process pleasure with the wisdom gained from recovery, people who've navigated addiction.
Exactly. Her core idea is that understanding this relationship, this science and lived experience combined, is absolutely essential for finding some kind of equilibrium in a world that just constantly throws opportunities for instant gratification at us.
Okay, so the book kicks off looking at this constant striving for pleasure, right? And the often counterintuitive results. A really key concept she introduces right away is the pleasure-pain balance in our brains, like a seesaw, you could say.
Precisely. Think of it like that. When we experience something pleasurable, dopamine gets released, tipping that seesaw towards pleasure. But the brain, it's always working to get back to level homeostasis.
Right.
So it has these built-in mechanisms, these little processes that work to level things out. And often that means generating the opposite feeling, maybe a bit of pain or unease, as that initial pleasure fades.
So every high has a kind of corresponding low, even if we don't always notice it consciously.
Exactly. It's an automatic counter-response. And Lembke illustrates this really well with a personal story. She was a psychiatry resident.
Oh, yeah, I remember this bit.
And she bumped into her psychotherapy supervisor completely outside their usual office setting.
And it was really jarring for her, wasn't it? This realization of the different worlds we all live in, professional versus personal. Seeing someone in a totally different context can be, well, surprisingly weird.
It really can. It made her think about how her own patients might see her outside of the therapy room,
Yeah. It's a great illustration of the roles we play, the boundaries we have, and maybe even how different neurological processes are at play within our own heads for pleasure and pain.
Well put. And then she introduces us to Jacob.
Right, Jacob, and his experiences with what he calls sex addiction. I have to say, reading the initial description of his compulsive behaviors, it was pretty startling.
Yeah, Lembke definitely uses Jacob's story early on to grab our attention, doesn't she? To show the more, let's say, extreme ways. How long did it last?
Like 2 days. And this, he says, was the beginning of his double life.
Which, as Lembke points out, is a really, really common pattern in addiction. That secret life, hiding the behavior not just from others, but sometimes even, deceiving yourself to some extent. That internal battle.
Yeah, wanting to stop, but feeling compelled to continue.
Exactly.
So, through his teens, Jacob would secretly masturbate to this drawing of Aphrodite he kept hidden in the attic. But interestingly, looking back, he called that period a time of innocence.
That contrast is quite telling, isn't it? It shows how our perspective on our past actions can change dramatically as we gain insight. What felt maybe private, even exciting then, gets reframed later through the lens of compulsion and secrecy.
Yeah. And then Jacob's story takes this really, unexpected turn. He builds an electrical stimulation device for masturbation.
Right. I remember reading that part.
The name he gave it, Penness, was something else. And the fact he combined using it with smoking cigarettes, trying to control the intensity.
It's really unsettling, but also incredibly revealing, I think. It shows the lengths the brain will go to chase intense pleasure and how specific rituals develop around these behaviors. His engineering of it, the unique name, it just highlights how deeply engaged he was with this particular reward.
Reading about Jacob actually reminded me of something, not nearly as extreme, obviously, but I went through this phase where I got completely hooked on those, really formulaic erotic romance novels.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was just devouring them one after another.
Right.
And it got to the point where I was kind of neglecting other things, letting stuff slide.
See, that's a perfect example. It shows how the same basic neurological principles driving severe addictions can show up in seemingly less harmful ways in everyday life. The compulsive consumption, prioritizing the reward over other things, the pattern, is actually remarkably similar.
Totally. I remember vividly. It was like 2 a.m. I was bleary-eyed, reading some awful cliche in 50 Shades of Grey.
Oh, dear.
And I suddenly thought, hang on, this is absolutely not how I want to spend my very limited, precious time. It was a minor wake-up call, sure, but it resonates with that feeling of being stuck in a loop that Jacob must have felt, just on a totally different scale.
And your experience, even if it feels trivial to you now, really underlines Lembke's main point about this growing problem of compulsive overconsumption, even in lives that seem, pretty good on the surface.
Yeah, I mean, loving husband, great kids, meaningful work, freedom, all the stuff you think protects you.
Exactly. All those protective factors, yet you still found yourself caught in that cycle, even briefly.
It really made me think about what the book calls the dark side of capitalism. How the whole societal landscape, the constant availability, the marketing of all these super pleasurable things, how much that contributes, how it fuels these behaviors.
Precisely. It's not just about individual willpower or some kind of personal failing. The environment we live in plays a huge, often underestimated role in shaping our desires and how susceptible we are to overconsumption.
So Jacob's story then moves to Germany, right? And pornography enters the picture, escalating over about a decade. And then comes 1995. The internet becomes widely available.
Which, as Lembke shows through Jacob's experience, was a massive turning point. The anonymity, the sheer volume, the accessibility of online porn, it just amplified his compulsion onto a whole new level.
To the point where he was prioritizing it over his job.
All right.
Almost lost everything.
Yeah, it brought him right to the brink.
It really hammers home that point about the dramatically increased potency and accessibility of modern rewards. And it's not just the internet. Lembke talks about pharmaceutical-grade opioids, too, like fentanyl lollipops. Incredibly potent, easily available in some situations.
The difference in potency is just staggering. Fentanyl, for instance, can be, 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine?
Wow.
That kind of exponential jump in strength drastically increases the risk of rapid tolerance, dependence, and, tragically, overdose.
And it's not limited to opioids. Even nicotine delivery, like with e-cigarettes, is way more efficient now than traditional smoking. Plus, those appealing flavors are clearly designed to hook people, especially younger people.
That combination, higher potency and really appealing delivery methods, makes these substances much more likely to disrupt that delicate pleasure-pain balance in the brain.
The book also touches on something called polypharmacy, which sounds quite concerning. It uses the example of Max, who ended up cycling through something like 14 different drugs in just over 10 years.
Yeah, 14 drugs. It paints a really stark, quite unsettling picture of how quickly things can spiral.
It really does.
Max's rapid progression through so many substances is a powerful, if disturbing, illustration of that escalating nature of addiction, that constant search for a stronger high, or just a different kind of high, as tolerance builds and the original drug stops working the same way.
What I found really insightful was the idea that the act of consumption itself can become the drug. Lembke uses Chi's online shopping addiction as an example.
Ah, yes, the whole cycle.
Right. The searching, the excitement of buying, waiting for the delivery, the ritual of opening the package. It's like the reward is baked into the whole process, not just owning the thing at the end.
Chi's story is a perfect illustration. The dopamine system isn't just triggered by the object itself, but by the whole set of behaviors and expectations around getting it. And the internet has just turbocharged this, hasn't it? With the ease of access, the tracking, the notifications, building anticipation.
And the internet, naturally, plays a huge part in social contagion, amplifying these things even more.
Yeah.
Look at Jacob again with online porn. He wasn't just consuming passively. He was creating custom routines for his device.
Downloading routines from others.
Even syncing his device with videos. It becomes this whole interconnected, almost collaborative world.
It really shifts from solitary use to this realm of shared experience, a kind of virtual social validation, which just reinforces the behavior even more strongly. The pleasure wasn't just physical, it was the anticipation, the tinkering, the experimentation, even feeling connected to others in these digital spaces.
And then it escalates again. Live online, pleasuring chat rooms, giving tokens, even broadcasting images of himself. That initial rush followed so quickly by deep guilt.
Yeah.
It seems like such a sadly predictable path.
It really highlights how short-lived that intense dopamine hit is and the almost inevitable crash that follows, often bringing with it significant shame and self-loathing, which then tragically can fuel the cycle again, seeking more reward to escape those awful feelings.
And the real-world consequences for Jacob were just devastating. His wife found out, gave him an ultimatum, he tried to quit, relapsed, and ultimately divorce.
Yeah.
It's just a stark, sobering reminder of the destructive power these compulsions can wield over actual lives and relationships.
Jacob's story really serves as this powerful, unsettling reminder of those very real consequences of unchecked compulsive behavior, the profound damage it can inflict on our most important connections and our overall well-being.
The book also makes a really vital point about vulnerability, doesn't it? How people in lower socioeconomic groups or with less education are often more vulnerable to compulsive overconsumption.
Yes, that's critical.
It's that combination of easier access to potent rewards and, crucially, less access to protective factors, things like meaningful work, safe housing, good education, healthcare, equality. It creates a really dangerous situation for some people.
It's a really critical point to grasp. Addiction doesn't happen in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
Socioeconomic factors play a really significant role, both in someone's initial vulnerability and in their access to resources and support for recovery. The tragic rise in deaths of despair, particularly among middle-aged white Americans without a college degree, which Case and Deaton documented so powerfully, is just a heartbreaking example of this complex mix of factors.
And this pervasive feeling of societal discomfort, maybe, seems to be feeding into a growing trend of medicating away our pain. The example given is David, who gets prescribed Paxil and Adderall for anxiety, depression, and ADD. It feels like we're increasingly reaching for a quick pharmacological fix.
And David's experience really illustrates that point well. While the medication might offer some initial comfort, some symptom relief, it doesn't always get to the root causes of the pain. In his case, you could argue it led to big changes in his academic direction, more social withdrawal. It suggests that just masking symptoms isn't the same as real healing, and sometimes it can have these unintended negative effects.
It feels almost paradoxical, though. In our modern world, there's this huge emphasis on achieving happiness, right? This massive proliferation of self-help stuff like those brochures Lembke saw at the Stanford Student Mental Health Clinic.
The habit of happiness, things like that.
Yeah. Sleep your way to happiness, all offering these prescriptive lists on how to get this elusive, happy state.
It really reflects our society's intense focus on positive emotions, this almost relentless pressure to be happy all the time. But that very pursuit can, ironically, become its own kind of compulsion for some. And it can also inadvertently make us feel like normal human emotions, like sadness or discomfort, are somehow wrong or need to be felt immediately. But they're essential parts of being human.
And this constant chase for happiness seems so different from what feels like a growing perception of fragility in modern kids. This trend of trying to shield them from any kind of adversity. Lembke mentions Kevin and his apparently consequence-free entitled lifestyle. His attitude was basically, I do whatever I want whenever I want.
That sounds like a recipe for major challenges later on.
There's a real valid concern there. By overprotecting children from experiencing discomfort or challenges or natural consequences, we might actually be stopping them from developing crucial resilience, coping skills, a realistic understanding of the world. If you never face real consequences as a kid, it can potentially foster entitlement and make it really hard to navigate life's inevitable difficulties later.
So maybe it's not that surprising then that we're seeing these steadily rising rates of psychiatric drug use in adults and kids, not just in the U.S., but globally. The stats Lembke provides comparing antidepressant use across countries are quite striking. They definitely make you stop and think. They certainly do. And while these medications are incredibly helpful, even life-saving for many, the sheer volume of prescriptions does raise important questions. Questions about our societal tendency to medicate discomfort and the potential long-term effects of this widespread approach.
There's this really simple but quite profound story in the book about a college student. She was constantly listening to music or podcasts, always had earbuds in.
Right.
And the suggestion was just to try walking to class in silence for once. Her initial reaction was resistance, like, no way.
Yeah.
But then she tried it and had this unexpectedly positive experience. She said, I started noticing the trees. It really stuck with me.
It's such a powerful reminder, isn't it? The value, often overlooked, of intentionally disconnecting from that constant barrage of external noise and just allowing ourselves space. Space for introspection, for simple, mindful observation of the world right around us. We get so used to constant stimulation, we can lose touch with our own internal landscape and the subtle beauty of everyday surroundings.
Then we revisit David. He's graduated college, but he's still using Adderall. And now he's feeling this persistent lack of motivation, plus a lot of underlying anger and resentment. It seems like the initial comfort or boost the meds gave him has worn off, maybe even left him feeling worse emotionally.
It really highlights the potential for developing dependence on these types of medications, relying on external substances to regulate mood, focus, motivation. It can ultimately undermine our own intrinsic drive and potentially lead to these unintended negative emotional states over time.
So let's circle back to that core idea, the pleasure-pain balance. Lembke explains our brains are constantly trying to keep this equilibrium. She uses this really vivid image of little gremlins that hop onto the pain side of the seesaw whenever we experience prolonged pleasure to counteract it.
Those gremlins are a really helpful way to picture the brain's natural homeostatic mechanisms, those automatic, mostly unconscious processes that work to bring us back to a neutral baseline after pleasure. It's an inherent reflexive response designed to stop us staying high for too long.
And this leads directly to the concept of tolerance, right? Needing more and more of something to get the same pleasure, or getting less pleasure from the same amount over time. My own deep dive rereading the entire Twilight saga a few years back definitely fits that bill.
Your Twilight binge is a perfect, highly relatable example. Tolerance can develop even with seemingly harmless rewards. Those diminishing returns, the increasing urge to recapture that initial buzz. Classic hallmarks of this basic neurological process.
And with prolonged, heavy use of really rewarding substances, that balance actually starts to shift fundamentally. The gremlins kind of set up camp on the pain side.
That's a great way to put it. They dig in.
Our basic hedonic set point changes. It makes us less able to feel natural pleasure and way more vulnerable to feeling discomfort and pain when we don't have the substance.
That's a really critical point. Chronic exposure to high dopamine levels essentially recalibrates the brain's baseline. It gets harder and harder to feel good without the substance, and the withdrawal symptoms, the discomfort when it's gone, become much more likely and much more severe.
The brain even encodes long-term memories of these intense rewards through something called experience-dependent plasticity. It's like the dopamine neurons themselves physically change structure.
Right, the dendrites, the branches, can actually grow longer and more complex.
And these changes can last a very long time, potentially even a lifetime.
These structural changes really show the profound, potentially lasting impact addictive substances can have on our basic neural wiring. It helps explain why cravings can feel so intense and persist for months, even years after someone stops using.
There's even research mentioned on cocaine in rats, showing it significantly increases their running wheel behavior. It's fascinating how these basic reward mechanisms work across species.
That rat study powerfully highlights how dopamine-releasing drugs can essentially hijack our natural reward pathways, leading to compulsive behaviors that can override even fundamental biological drives.
But it's not just neurochemistry, is it? The meaning we assign to pain also massively affects how we perceive it. That study of wounded WWII soldiers.
Beecher study, yes.
They reported surprisingly less pain than civilians with similar injuries just because of the context. Their wounds meant survival, going home. It's incredible.
It's a really profound example. Our psychological state, the meaning we attach to experiences, can dramatically alter our perception of even very real physical sensations. For those soldiers, the injury, however bad, represented relief, the end of combat. That likely significantly reduced their perceived suffering.
All of this really sets the scene for part 2 of the book, doesn't it? Which is called self-binding. And it introduces this kind of counterintuitive idea.
Which is?
That people who've struggled with the extremes of addiction have actually developed a unique kind of wisdom. Wisdom that's really relevant to all of us trying to navigate this modern world overflowing with rewards.
Exactly. Their often very difficult experiences offer really crucial insights into practical strategies that, well, maybe all of us can use to better manage our own tendencies towards compulsive overconsumption in different parts of our lives.
Okay, so part 2 starts with Delilah and this idea of a dopamine fast. Delilah's a teenager, mainly in therapy because her parents made her go.
Pretty typical scenario.
And Lembke observes that high dopamine activities and substances almost always cause problems eventually, even if the negative consequences aren't obvious right away. And that disconnect immediate pleasure versus eventual pain isn't just a teenage thing, is it?
Not at all. Delilah's initial difficulty grasping the potential downsides of her regular cannabis use is incredibly common, and not just for teens. Anyone engaged in a compulsive behavior can experience this. That intense, immediate pleasure acts like a powerful blind spot, hiding the long-term risks.
Lembke shares this really clever therapeutic technique, asking about future use to create more urgency for change. She asked Delilah, "Do you see yourself still using cannabis like this in 10 years? Then 5 years? Then just 1 year?" And that last question seemed to really hit home for Delilah.
That's a great example of motivational interviewing. By gently prompting her to think about her future self, her long-term goals, Lembke helps Delilah see the potential gap between her current behavior and the future she might actually want.
The book then explains cross-addiction, basically swapping one addiction for another. It makes sense, doesn't it? If you give up one intense reward, you might be more vulnerable to another that gives a similar dopamine hit, helps fight off those gremlins.
Cross-addiction is very well known in recovery circles. When someone stops one addictive behavior, they can be particularly vulnerable to picking up another if they haven't addressed the underlying reward-seeking patterns and that need for dopamine.
Interestingly, though, Lembke notes that a small number of patients don't actually feel better after a dopamine fast. And this can be a really important clue.
Right, suggesting there might be other underlying psychiatric issues that need attention at the same time. That's a really crucial clinical point. Addiction often co-occurs with other mental health conditions. For lasting recovery, it's absolutely vital to identify and treat those co-occurring issues alongside the addiction itself.
Lembke also makes sure to prepare people, her patients, and us as readers, for the likelihood of feeling worse before feeling better during that initial withdrawal phase. She uses Delilah's experience quitting cannabis and points out that for anxiety, the turning point often seems to be around 2 weeks.
Understanding that initial withdrawal is a natural, expected part of the brain recalibrating after chronic high dopamine exposure can be incredibly helpful. Knowing that rough timeline can give people the resilience to push through that initial discomfort, knowing it's temporary.
Then we get into mindfulness, defined here as observing our own brain activity without judging it. Lembke kind of jokes about the paradoxical nature of the brain trying to watch itself.
It is a bit of a mind bender. But the core idea of mindfulness is cultivating that detached awareness of our thoughts, feelings, sensations. Seeing them as transient events passing through, not as defining who we are or as commands we have to follow.
She uses that beautiful analogy of observing the Milky Way, seeing thoughts and emotions as distinct entities, part of a bigger whole, separate but connected to us. And the non-judgment part is key, right? Just observing without trying to suppress or get caught up in it.
That's absolutely crucial. Self-criticism, judging our thoughts, can actually amplify negative feelings and make it much harder to just observe objectively and ultimately learn from them.
Lembke shares a really powerful personal story. After childbirth, she had this disturbing, intrusive thought. Mindfulness helped her see it for what it was, fear, not a real desire. It's a very compelling, relatable example.
That's a very common experience for new mothers, actually. And it beautifully shows how mindfulness can help differentiate between fleeting, sometimes distressing thoughts, and our underlying emotions or true intentions. It reduces anxiety and self-blame.
And mindfulness seems especially important in early abstinence from an addiction, doesn't it? When people are often flooded with overwhelming thoughts and intense feelings, they used to numb with the substance or behavior.
Definitely. In those early stages, without the usual dopamine-fueled distractions, you can get hit with a wave of uncomfortable stuff.
Yes.
Mindfulness gives you skills to observe these experiences without being totally swept away, creating space for more awareness and control.
So Delilah, after being sober for a while, eventually says she wants to try moderating her cannabis use. She recognized she felt like the best version of me when she was abstinent.
Mm-hmm.
This leads into the N in Lembke's dopamine mnemonic next steps. And that very common desire among people who've achieved abstinence to eventually go back to using, but, moderately this time.
That desire to return to controlled use after experiencing the benefits of being sober is incredibly common. After feeling that clarity, that well-being, many people start to believe they can now manage it without it becoming a problem again.
But, as Lembke points out, even when moderation might technically be possible, many find the constant effort, the vigilance needed, just too exhausting. They often choose long-term abstinence as a more sustainable, less stressful path.
It's a constant mental balancing act.
Which really brings up the super relevant question. How do we even think about moderating things like food or smartphones in our current high dopamine world. Things we can't just quit entirely.
The whole idea of moderation gets incredibly complex and challenging when highly rewarding things are just everywhere, all the time. It demands huge self-awareness, constant self-control, and yeah, it can often feel mentally draining.
Then we revisit Jacob, and it's such a stark reminder of how easily old patterns resurface. His relapse started just by turning on the TV in a hotel room,
Just like that.
which quickly sent him down the rabbit hole of online porn and eventually even rebuilding that electrical stimulation machine.
Jacob's relapse really powerfully shows the enduring strength of environmental cues and triggers, even something seemingly harmless like a TV in a strange place. It also tragically demonstrates that cyclical nature of addiction, the persistent pull of those established reward pathways.
The relapse cycle unfolded over several days. He kept trying to stop, but struggled even though he genuinely wanted to quit. It just highlights that incredibly powerful grip of compulsive behavior, that internal conflict between wanting freedom and feeling utterly unable to break free.
That internal conflict, the real desire to stop clashing so hard with the seemingly irresistible compulsion that's really a defining, often heartbreaking part of addiction, it shows it's not just about willpower or making a conscious choice.
This brings us to physical self-binding. Oscar's strategy of locking away his alcohol is a classic example. But even those simple barriers can be overcome, right? Oscar managed to get around his own lockbox with just pliers and a straw.
Oscar's ingenuity in bypassing his own controls, while maybe a little bit funny at first, really highlights the limits of relying only on external physical barriers. That underlying drive for the reward can be incredibly strong, leading to surprisingly creative solutions.
Modern tools, like the K-Safe kitchen safe with its time lock, seem like maybe a more foolproof option for physical binding in some cases.
Potentially, yes.
And then there's pharmaceutical self-binding, like naltrexone implants for heroin addiction. Although, as Lembke notes with that patient in China, even those aren't always 100% effective.
These newer tools offer more robust external control, but ultimately their long-term success still relies on the person's underlying commitment to abstinence and their willingness to actually use these supports. Meds like naltrexone can help block the effects of opioids, reduce the rewarding feeling, but they don't necessarily eliminate the cravings or the complex psychological stuff involved.
Right. And there's disulfiram, antabuse, which makes you feel awful if you drink alcohol, another pharmaceutical option. But again, remember Arnold cleverly hiding the pill in his missing tooth gap.
Huh.
Yes, people find ways around things if the drive is strong enough. And then you have the more permanent anatomical self-binding, like weight loss surgeries.
These more drastic steps really show the severity of the struggle some people face with compulsive overconsumption and the lengths they might feel they need to go to try and regain control over their behavior and health.
On a much, much smaller scale, I totally related to Lembke getting rid of her Kindle, creating that physical barrier against her own compulsive romance novel habit. Sometimes just adding a bit of friction, a little inconvenience, can be surprisingly effective at disrupting an automatic behavior.
That's a really practical, insightful point. Removing easy, immediate access can break the automaticity of the behavior, giving you that crucial moment of pause to make a more conscious choice.
Then there's chronological self-binding setting time limits. Like this student who tried to limit cannabis use to weekends, but then the rules started slipping.
Gradually shifting.
Yeah. Seems like that psychological thing, delayed discounting, really undermines these attempts over time.
Delayed discounting our built-in tendency to value immediate rewards much more highly than larger rewards further down the line is a huge hurdle for successful chronological binding. That immediate hit often outweighs the importance of longer-term goals or consequences. Muhammad's struggle with cannabis, despite wanting to limit it, illustrates that perfectly.
So, categorical self-binding is a more comprehensive approach, like Jacob's response after his big relapse, getting rid of the machine completely, putting away all electronics for a while, going back to church, consciously stopping the self-shaming thoughts. It's about creating much wider boundaries.
Categorical self-binding means setting rules around whole categories of things or activities known to trigger the compulsive behavior. Jacob's approach was incredibly thorough, targeting not just the direct triggers, but also related environmental and internal factors that fed into his struggles.
The example of the gluten-free diet as categorical binding is interesting too, especially how the market adapts, right? Offering gluten-free versions of everything, which can sometimes unintentionally weaken that boundary for some people.
That's a really insightful observation. It highlights the ongoing challenge of effective self-binding in a world that's constantly adapting to cater to our desires. What starts as a significant barrier can become less effective as new alternatives pop up.
The famous marshmallow experiment comes up too. Its link between delaying gratification and later life success is well known, but the less discussed part.
What the kids actually did to resist.
Exactly. Using strategies like distraction, reframing the marshmallow, that offers really valuable insights into self-control mechanisms we can all use.
Those self-regulation strategies the kids spontaneously came up with offer crucial clues about the cognitive skills, the internal resources that help us manage impulses and delay gratification throughout life.
Lembke mentions observing this almost tangible sense of rightness or inner alignment in patients who are genuinely making progress. Jacob reconciling with his wife after his struggles is such a beautiful, concrete example of that.
That feeling of increased integration, a greater sense of alignment between behavior and core values or goals, is often a really significant sign of positive change, of genuine recovery. When people are living in a way that feels more authentic, more congruent with who they want to be.
And part 2 finishes with this really powerful, almost paradoxical statement.
Right.
Sometimes actively binding ourselves using these strategies can actually lead to greater freedom. It sounds a backward at first, but it makes so much sense when you think about it.
By consciously setting limits, creating structure, we can actually free ourselves from the often tyrannical grip of our immediate impulses. We regain a greater sense of agency, control over our choices, and ultimately our well-being.
Okay, so part 3 shifts focus to the pursuit of pain. It starts with Chris and his reliance on buprenorphine to manage intense opioid cravings. Lembke explains how buprenorphine works by basically helping level out that pleasure-pain balance.
Buprenorphine's effectiveness in significantly reducing cravings and the very serious risk of overdose is well established medically. It acts as a partial opioid agonist, helping stabilize the brain's reward system without giving that intense high of full agonists like heroin.
Chris's backstory is a really stark picture of how addiction can grab hold even in seemingly successful people. Medical leave from Stanford, discovering drugs, academic struggles, eventually identifying as a drug addict, using heroin in San Francisco. It shows how addiction can derail even the most promising lives.
His journey really powerfully illustrates the incredibly strong pull of opioids, how quickly dependence can develop, leading to major disruptions in education, relationships, overall health.
His return to Stanford, proactively asking for buprenorphine and then successfully graduating and getting his PhD, that's definitely inspiring. But Lembke notes this lingering side effect.
The obotic lack of emotion.
Yeah, kind of flatness.
That observation raises a really complex, important question about the potential long-term effects of both chronic opioid use and maintenance therapies like buprenorphine on emotional experience. It suggests that while buprenorphine can be truly life-saving, it might also have subtler impacts on the range and intensity of feelings.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Can prolonged heavy drug use cause permanent changes to that pleasure-pain balance?
Yeah.
Does it mean some people might need lifelong opioid maintenance just to feel what they perceive as normal?
Or, as the book thoughtfully suggests, maybe the deficit wasn't just in Chris's brain, but maybe also in the world around him. And buprenorphine was his way of adapting to that environment.
That's a profound thought.
It really challenges a purely biological view of addiction and pushes us to consider the significant role of external factors and individual adaptation. It's a complex interplay.
Lembke then discusses the risks of using medications that directly push on the pleasure side of the balance. The main worry being the potential for addiction to those very meds. She shares this really poignant story.
About the patient who tapered off OxyContin.
Yes, and regained her ability to fully enjoy music. It highlights that counterintuitive way long-term opioid use can actually blunt pleasure in other parts of life.
That's a powerful illustration of something called opioid-induced hyperalgesia, but extending beyond just increased pain sensitivity. It suggests chronic opioid exposure can negatively impact the capacity for pleasure in other areas too, an unintended consequence.
It actually triggered some of my own childhood memories of being prescribed medication and made me question the broader implications. Our societal tendency to medicate ourselves to adapt to the world. It also raises ethical concerns, doesn't it? Could psychotropic meds inadvertently become a form of social control? Especially thinking about the higher prescription rates among kids from lower-income families.
These are really important ethical considerations for society to grapple with. We need to stay critically aware of potential over-medication and carefully examine the underlying social and economic factors that might contribute to disparities in psychiatric drug use across different groups.
Then we meet Michael, Former Silicon Valley millionaire, self-described attention whore, history of seeking boosts from cocaine and alcohol, his accidental discovery of cold showers.
And their surprisingly positive effect on his mood. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it led him to ice baths, adding more ice to get the temperature even lower.
Michael's experience really highlights the potential for non-drug interventions, even simple things like cold water, to significantly impact mood, energy, well-being. His description of feeling high after ice baths is striking, suggests a powerful physiological response.
It turns out there's actual science behind it. The book mentions a study showing significant increases in both dopamine and norepinephrine in the brain during and after cold water immersion.
That Charles University study provides a compelling biological basis for Michael's subjective experience. It shows a substantial release of key neurotransmitters involved in mood, alertness, and stress response, directly triggered by cold stress.
The book also touches on the amazing neuronal regrowth seen in hibernating ground squirrels as they warm up.
Yeah.
It just underscores the brain's incredible capacity for plasticity, for regeneration, even after extreme conditions.
It's a really fascinating biological example of the brain's remarkable ability to adapt, even regrow tissue in response to significant environmental and physiological challenges.
So this whole idea, intentionally pressing on the pain side of the balance, can indirectly lead to pleasure, maybe even a more lasting pleasure than just chasing pleasure directly. This brings us to the science of hormesis.
Hormesis, right. The principle that small to moderate doses of normally noxious things, cold, heat, exercise, can actually be beneficial.
Like a mild stressor that triggers adaptive, ultimately health-promoting responses in the body and brain.
Exactly. What might be harmful in large doses can paradoxically be beneficial in smaller, controlled amounts.
Intermittent fasting is given as an example of hormesis. Even exercise itself, initially stressful, causes cellular damage, but ultimately improves health and resilience. It really makes you think about our modern sedentary lives. Maybe the absence of these natural stressors contributes to an imbalance in our dopamine systems.
Our evolutionary past involved way more physical activity, exposure to various natural stressors. The relative lack of these in our modern, often overly comfortable lives might indeed contribute to dysregulation of our natural reward systems, potentially making us more vulnerable to seeking stimulation and reward in less healthy ways.
It's almost like our attraction to some addictive behaviors might partly come from a subconscious reminder that we still have physical bodies that need engaging, challenging somehow.
That's an interesting thought.
And Lembke stresses that even just 30 minutes of moderate daily activity, like walking, can have profound positive effects. Mood, anxiety, cognition, energy, sleep.
That's a really crucial, empowering takeaway. Simple, consistent physical movement can have a significant, multifaceted, positive impact on both physical and mental well-being.
But deliberately seeking out pain or discomfort is inherently harder than seeking pleasure, isn't it?
Yeah.
Goes against our instincts. And we seem to have such short memories for the eventual pleasure that follows discomfort or effort.
It often requires a conscious, deliberate effort to override that immediate desire for comfort and ease. To cultivate trust that enduring some initial discomfort will ultimately lead to a positive, rewarding outcome.
The book even briefly mentions the history of using electricity to treat mental illness. The first ECT treatment seemed to provide this hormetic shock to the brain, leading to a dramatic recovery in that initial patient.
While the exact mechanisms are complex, and modern ECT is much more refined and humane with anesthesia and muscle relaxants, it does serve as a historical example. A significant controlled stimulus triggering a powerful compensatory therapeutic response in the brain.
What doesn't kill me makes me stronger, as Nietzsche famously put it, which nicely leads into David's therapy homework.
Making small talk with strangers.
Yes. To overcome his fear of social interaction, his systematic approach, actually measuring his distress levels during these interactions, is really interesting.
David's deliberate, measured approach to confronting his social anxiety beautifully demonstrates the power of systematic desensitization and cognitive restructuring in overcoming fear over time.
And the fact he had a positive outcome, eventually finding real enjoyment in social interactions, is so encouraging. This is then contrasted with someone like Alex Honnold, the climber, who seems fearless. But it turns out his amazing feats are likely due to massive, deliberate training, gradually increasing his comfort zone. It suggests neuroadaptation to fear.
Honnold's remarkable abilities really highlight that even seemingly innate traits can be significantly shaped by dedicated training, repeated exposure. His brain has essentially adapted over time to perceive and react to extreme heights less fearfully.
There's a great parallel drawn between Honnold methodically climbing this huge fear mountain and David's more gradual journey, learning to tolerate and overcome social anxiety. It's all about intentionally pushing boundaries, expanding comfort zones.
Both examples powerfully illustrate the incredible potential for personal growth and adaptation when we deliberately, systematically confront our fears and discomforts instead of constantly trying to avoid them.
Michael's continued experiments with cold therapy, though pushing himself to more extreme temperatures, longer durations, eventually lead him to realize that even this seemingly healthy thing could become an addiction itself. A good reminder that even beneficial activities can become problematic if taken to extremes.
That's a really crucial point. Any behavior or activity triggering significant dopamine release has the inherent potential to become addictive if pursued compulsively, even things generally considered healthy. Moderation and consistent self-awareness are key to maintaining balance.
Professor Alan Rosenwasser's research on neurogenesis and exercise is fascinating too. He explains that voluntary running wheels in labs stimulate new neuron growth through some of the very same neurochemical pathways activated by addictive drugs.
Right, like endo-opioid, dopamine, endocannabinoid pathways.
But he cautions that this doesn't mean compulsive wheel running is a perfect model for a healthy human lifestyle.
Rosenwasser's research highlights the complex, nuanced relationship between exercise and the brain's reward system. While exercise has tons of benefits, the intensity and potential compulsivity of some forms can tap into similar pathways as substance use. Context matters.
And it's interesting, they've observed voluntary wheel running in various wild animals too, suggesting an intrinsic reward not just related to finding food or survival.
That observation certainly suggests there's likely an inherent rewarding aspect to certain types of movement, maybe related to endorphins and other neurochemicals, beyond just meeting basic needs.
Lembke then talks about extreme sports as essentially slamming hard on the pain and fear side of the balance, creating a potent drug through intense pain, fear, and the adrenaline rush. And she notes that even stress alone, without physical injury, can trigger increased dopamine release.
These high-intensity activities trigger a massive release of stress hormones and neurotransmitters, including dopamine. It creates a really powerful physiological and psychological response that can be intensely rewarding and, for some, potentially addictive.
But the crucial point is, we can develop tolerance to painful stimuli over time, resetting our brain's baseline towards the pain side. A study of skydivers surprisingly showed they had an increased likelihood of anhedonia, reduced ability to feel pleasure, suggesting a potential downside to repeatedly chasing those intense natural highs.
This really suggests that repeatedly pushing the pleasure-pain balance too far, even with natural rewards, can potentially blunt the ability to experience joy and pleasure in more everyday situations.
There is also the well-known overtraining syndrome in endurance athletes, where excessive exercise stops producing endorphins and instead leads to depletion, fatigue, even dysphoria. Really underscores the need for balance.
It really emphasizes the importance of listening to our bodies, avoiding pushing to extremes, even in activities generally considered incredibly beneficial for health.
The book also briefly touches on invisible incentives in white-collar work and the increasing mechanization and lack of meaning in many blue-collar jobs, suggesting these societal shifts might also contribute to dopamine imbalance in different ways.
The nature of modern work, often focused on external metrics and rewards, sometimes with less intrinsic satisfaction or purpose, can indeed impact our dopamine system. It might make us more susceptible to seeking pleasure and reward elsewhere.
I even personally related to the idea that flow, that deep concentration, can feel like a drug itself, but one that can also be isolating if it replaces human connection. A reminder that even positive activities need balance.
That state of deep, focused engagement can be incredibly rewarding and productive, but it's also really important to maintain a healthy balance with social connection and other aspects of a well-rounded, fulfilling life.
The discussion on pursuing pain ends with Michael reflecting that his cold water immersion never really got out of hand, and he currently does it moderately. It offers a somewhat hopeful view that it is possible to engage with potentially intense stimuli in a balanced, non-addictive way.
Michael's experience suggests that with enough self-awareness and intention, it is possible to engage with activities that trigger strong physiological responses in a controlled, ultimately beneficial way, without crossing into compulsive or addictive behavior.
Okay, Chapter 8 then dives into the vital topic of radical honesty. It's pretty surprising to learn the average number of lies adults apparently tell daily.
It is quite high, isn't it?
And while deception exists in the animal kingdom for survival, The book argues that in our modern world of relative plenty, lying carries big risks: isolation, increased cravings, ultimately overconsumption.
While small lies might feel like they offer short-term advantages, they can build up over time, significantly eroding trust both with others and with ourselves. In a world where basic needs are generally met, the long-term benefits of honesty, especially for fostering connection and self-awareness, far outweigh the perceived gains from deception.
Maria's inspiring transformation after years of therapy really highlights this. That simple story about her opening her brother's package, lying about it, and the negative emotional fallout she felt. It shows the heavy burden of dishonesty, even over small things. Her eventual confession and a positive shift in their relationship beautifully demonstrates the healing power of telling the truth.
Maria's experience really beautifully illustrates the significant psychological weight even seemingly minor lies can carry, and the profound sense of liberation and improved connection that comes from choosing radical honesty, even when it feels hard initially.
Lembke introduces the lying habit, how these small, seemingly insignificant lies can become automatic, almost reflexive. And Maria's description of feeling almost overwhelmingly free after finally telling the truth about the package. You can almost feel it.
The lying habit can become deeply ingrained. Yeah, breaking free from that pattern can lead to a really significant drop in underlying anxiety and guilt, freeing up mental and emotional energy for more authentic engagement with life.
The book defines radical honesty as telling the complete truth about big and small things, especially when it exposes vulnerabilities and might have negative consequences. Lembke argues it's absolutely crucial for addiction recovery and for living a more balanced, fulfilling life generally. She lists several key benefits.
Like promoting self-awareness.
Exactly. Promoting awareness, fostering deeper intimacy, letting us create a more truthful life story, and it can even be contagious, inspiring others to be more honest too.
Radical honesty really acts as a powerful form of self-awareness, forcing us to confront our actions, motivations, consequences. It's also a cornerstone for building genuine trust and deeper intimacy, and it lets us construct a more coherent, authentic sense of self over time.
Lembke explains denial as this fundamental disconnect that can happen between the brain's powerful reward pathways and those higher-level cortical regions responsible for narrating experiences, understanding consequences, future planning. She notes that a big focus in addiction treatment is often strengthening those connections.
Addiction can often create a significant disconnect between immediate desires, the chase for short-term pleasure, and our more considered long-term goals and values. A key aim in therapy is often helping people bridge that gap, develop greater self-awareness, and strengthen their capacity for insight and future-oriented thinking.
The neurobiological research on honesty by Christian Ruff and colleagues is really fascinating. They showed that stimulating the prefrontal cortex, that area involved in decision-making, emotion regulation, future planning, storytelling, actually reduces lying, which naturally makes you wonder, could consistently practicing honesty also have a reciprocal effect? Maybe stimulate and strengthen that same brain area over time.
Ruff's research provides a really compelling neurobiological basis for the prefrontal cortex's critical role in honest behavior. And it's certainly a very plausible hypothesis that consistently engaging in honesty could indeed strengthen those associated neural pathways, like any other skill we practice.
Lembke proposes that consistently telling the truth might indeed lead to tangible brain changes, potentially increasing our awareness of the pleasure-pain balance, our own compulsive tendencies, ultimately leading to more conscious, healthier choices. It's a really hopeful view of our capacity for change.
The idea that our own deliberate behaviors can actively shape our brain's structure and function, reinforcing positive cycles, promoting greater self-awareness and control, that's a core principle of neuroplasticity. It forms a fundamental basis for the potential for lasting recovery and personal growth.
My own somewhat ironic dawning awareness of my romance novel habit while I was actually teaching psychiatry residents about the neurobiology of addiction was definitely a humbling moment.
I can imagine.
That learning exercise where I had to partner with a resident and honestly talk about my reading habit, its negative impacts, what I felt I was giving up. It was a real turning point.
That kind of personal realization, often triggered by something external forcing us to see our own behaviors differently, is a very common, often crucial first step in recognizing and addressing a problematic pattern.
Realizing my family and work were ultimately way more valuable than the fleeting pleasure from those books. Actually getting rid of my e-reader. Even feeling the initial withdrawal symptoms. It all led to a really significant shift in perspective. Honesty with myself, even about something seemingly small, was absolutely key.
Your experience beautifully illustrates that process. Recognizing a potential compulsion, taking concrete, often hard steps to limit access, navigating the initial discomfort, and ultimately finding greater clarity and freedom.
And this practice of radical honesty also profoundly fosters more intimate, authentic human connections. Even though it feels counterintuitive sometimes, exposing vulnerabilities. Personally, working through some long-held resentments towards my mother during residency, guided by my supervisor's openness about his own recovery from alcoholism, that was incredibly transformative. Shifting from just blaming her to honestly looking at my own contributions to our strained relationship was huge.
Vulnerability and self-disclosure in a safe, supportive relationship can be incredibly powerful catalyst for deepening intimacy, fostering empathy, strengthening trust. Taking ownership of our part in conflicts is absolutely essential for personal growth and for the possibility of real healing and reconciliation.
It's definitely an ongoing effort for me, consistently practicing truth-telling in all my relationships. And that almost immediate feeling of rightness, that inner peace when I take accountability, even when it's tough, is so rewarding. Cultivating a more truthful life story really does foster greater authenticity, spontaneity, overall freedom in how we move through the world.
Living in greater alignment with our values, taking consistent responsibility for our actions, really does lead to a more profound sense of integrity and inner peace. Fosters a stronger, more authentic sense of self.
The book then introduces this really interesting idea of a plenty versus a scarcity mindset tied to honesty. Lembke argues that consistently telling the truth actually creates a feeling of abundance, of plenty in our lives, while lying tends to breed a pervasive sense of scarcity.
Makes sense. When people around us are reliable, truthful, we naturally feel more confident, more secure in the world.
Conversely, lying and broken promises create this sense of underlying danger, uncertainty, often leading us to prioritize short-term gains, immediate gratification.
A pervasive sense of trust and predictability in our social environment really does foster greater security, allowing us to focus on longer-term goals. Dishonesty undermines that fundamental trust, creating instability and insecurity.
The experiment by Warren Bickel, showing how scarcity narratives impact our ability to delay gratification, is really insightful here. And Lembke makes the compelling point that the constant dopamine overload, the exaggerated portrayals on social media, can paradoxically create a feeling of scarcity, of missing out, even when we're surrounded by relative material abundance.
In a world constantly bombarding us with stimulating content and often unrealistic images of others' seemingly perfect lives, we can indeed develop this pervasive sense of lack of missing out, which can, in turn, drive more impulsive, reward-seeking behaviors.
But Lembke also offers the hopeful view that a genuine sense of plenty can exist even in actual scarcity, stemming from deep belief in something larger than oneself, from strong, authentic human connections, all requiring radical honesty. Drake's powerful story.
Getting the DUI in medical school?
Yes, and his courageous decision to be completely radically honest with the court about everything, which led to some unexpectedly positive outcomes. It's a really compelling example.
Drake's experience, while, yes, we need to acknowledge outcomes vary due to systemic issues and privilege, it really powerfully illustrates the potential for radical honesty to elicit empathy, even unexpected leniency in tough situations.
The discussion on radical honesty wraps up by really hammering home its many benefits: fostering self-awareness, deepening relationships, promoting accountability, strengthening our ability to delay gratification, and ultimately playing a huge role in preventing and overcoming addiction. It really seems like a foundational tool for a more balanced, fulfilling life.
It really does seem foundational for building a more authentic, resilient, and ultimately more fulfilling life, both for ourselves and in our connections with others.
Okay, Chapter 9 then shifts to the complex topic of prosocial shame. Lembke starts by clarifying that important difference between shame, feeling fundamentally bad or flawed as a person, and guilt, feeling bad about a specific action.
Right, that distinction is crucial.
Then she introduces destructive shame, rejection, condemnation, shunning, versus prosocial shame, acceptance, empathy, guidance towards redemption.
And the societal response to our mistakes plays a vital role. Destructive shame isolates people, perpetuates negative behaviors. Prosocial shame fosters connection, provides a path towards positive change and reconciliation.
Lori's difficult story using Ambien to get high, mixing sleeping pills and cough medicine, developing paranoid beliefs is a powerful example of how destructive shame works. Her fear of seeking help because of the expectation of being a perfect Christian, the subtle discouragement from her church. It shows how people get trapped in that isolating cycle.
Lori's story really powerfully highlights how judgment, a lack of understanding, and empathy within a community can actually stop people from getting the help they desperately need. It can unfortunately perpetuate harmful, dangerous behaviors.
And while religious groups often report lower rates of substance misuse, Lembke notes they can inadvertently contribute to destructive shame if they react to transgressions with shunning, condemnation, or by fostering secrecy and fear of judgment. The resulting cycle is often overconsumption, intense shame, shunning, vying, isolation, ongoing consumption to cope.
That's a really clear, concerning cycle. When communities, which should ideally be sources of support, respond to struggles with condemnation instead of empathy and help, it can tragically drive people further into the shadows, deeper into addiction.
Lembke then holds up Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, as a compelling model for pro-social shame and action. That powerful story of her mentor.
His secret drinking, the shame when his wife found out.
Yes. And how that shame, instead of leading to more isolation, actually pushed him towards AA, which he called a profound de-shaming process. It's really impactful.
AA really provides this unique community where people can openly share struggles and vulnerabilities without harsh judgment. It fosters a crucial sense of belonging, offers a supportive path to recovery based on shared experience and mutual understanding.
The whole idea of pro-social shame hinges on the fundamental belief that everyone is flawed, everyone needs forgiveness and support sometimes. And Lembke highlights the importance of having a clear to-do list for making amends after shame, like the 12 steps in AA.
That element of actively taking responsibility, making sincere efforts to repair harm caused, is absolutely crucial for moving beyond shame and taking concrete steps towards personal growth and reconciliation.
So the cycle of pro-social shame looks very different. Overconsumption, shame, radical honesty, acceptance, empathy, plus amends, increased belonging, decreased consumption. It's a much healthier dynamic.
It really offers a much more constructive, supportive pathway. Breaking free from the isolating, damaging cycle of destructive shame by fostering genuine connection, encouraging personal accountability, and offering the possibility of forgiveness and reintegration.
Even honestly disclosing a relapse in an AA meeting can create what Lem calls club goods. Shared empathy, altruism, maybe even a bit of schadenfreude that if it can happen to them, feeling. But she also notes the challenge of free riders and groups, those who don't follow norms, lie, make no real effort as they threaten these club goods. The strictness of many 12-step groups might actually be key to their effectiveness in maintaining these norms, protecting the community from free riders.
The structure, clear guidelines, emphasis on accountability in 12-step groups really help create a safe, supportive environment conducive to long-term recovery, encouraging honesty, mutual support, shared commitment to change.
Joan's powerful story of successful recovery through AA, how it positively transformed her life, really speaks to the potential of this model. And even my own, much less serious experience with the Easter bunnies.
Oh, the chocolate bunnies again?
Secretly eating them, the shame, the little lies, and finally confessing. The instructive lesson for me and my kids about flaws, accountability, forgiveness, fostering a family culture of growth, it mirrors these principles on a smaller scale.
Your personal anecdote beautifully illustrates how even seemingly minor dishonesty can generate shame, and how choosing honesty and responsibility can lead to repair and growth in our closest relationships.
Lembke also points out that this honest self-reappraisal lets us offer more honest, constructive feedback to others. And practicing radical honesty without shaming is so crucial when teaching kids about their strengths and weaknesses. Sharing the example of the difficult but ultimately kind decision to stop our daughter's piano lessons when it was clear she had no real aptitude or enjoyment.
Honest, compassionate communication about both strengths and limitations is absolutely crucial for healthy personal development and for fostering genuine self-awareness in ourselves and our kids.
Okay, Chapter 10 brings us to the final core principle. The pursuit of pain, again. Lembke starts by reiterating that we're often drawn to pleasurable escapes to cope with the inherent discomfort of being human and the easy availability of these escapes today. But she emphasizes that while they offer temporary relief, they often worsen problems long term.
Right.
Then she asked this really thought-provoking question. What if, instead of constantly trying to escape the world, we intentionally chose to immerse ourselves more fully in it, even in its discomforts?
Instead of constantly seeking temporary relief through external rewards and distractions, the idea is that actively engaging with the world, even embracing its challenges and discomforts, can ultimately offer a more sustainable, meaningful form of fulfillment.
We revisit Muhammad. He struggled with traditional self-binding to limit his cannabis use. But during a hike at Point Reyes, an experience that initially triggered cravings, painful memories, he had this unexpected aha moment.
What happened?
He found himself intensely focusing his camera on a tiny beetle. And in that act of deep concentration, his cravings actually lessened.
Wow, that's fascinating. Mohammed's experience beautifully highlights the powerful potential of finding absorbing, engaging activities in the real world as a healthy, fulfilling alternative to substance use. That intense focus, the presence of mind needed for close-up nature photography, gave him a compelling, readily available reward that effectively displaced his cravings.
The very process of intentionally achieving stillness, focusing for that close-up shot, it grounded him in the present moment, provided a really compelling, accessible alternative to his usual escape through drugs. And with that powerful example, the book concludes by summarizing the 10 key lessons of the balance.
These 10 lessons really encapsulate the core principles and insights Lembke explored throughout the book, offering a concise, practical guide for understanding the complex dynamics of pleasure and pain, and ultimately navigating towards greater balance in our modern lives.
Just to quickly recap those 10 lessons for you. 1. Pain and pleasure are processed in the same brain area. 2. Chasing pleasure can paradoxically lead to pain. 3. We adapt quickly to pleasure, downregulating dopamine receptors.
4. The best way to reset our hedonic set point is abstinence. 5. Self-binding strategies help maintain abstinence. 6. External rewards can erode intrinsic motivation.
7. Beware of getting addicted to pain itself. 8. Radical honesty promotes awareness, intimacy, and a plenty mindset. 9. Pro-social shame affirms we belong to the human tribe and encourages change.
And finally, 10. Instead of running from the world, we can find escape by immersing ourselves in it.
These are really powerful, interconnected principles, aren't they? Offering a valuable framework for understanding our often complex relationship with pleasure and pain, and for actively cultivating greater equilibrium and fulfillment.
Absolutely. A really useful framework for daily life.
Well, that brings us towards the end of this deep dive into key excerpts from Anna Lembke's Dopamine Nation. I really hope this exploration has given you, our listener, a quick but also thorough understanding of her core insights, the dynamics of pleasure, pain, and that often challenging path to finding balance in our intensely stimulating modern world.
We've certainly covered some really surprising, thought-provoking stuff, haven't we? From the brain's pleasure-pain seesaw to the counterintuitive science of self-binding, the potential benefits of occasionally pursuing discomfort, the transformative power of radical honesty, and the crucial role of pro-social shame in fostering growth and community.
Understanding these connected concepts can really offer valuable new perspectives, I think, on our own personal habits and also on the broader societal context of consumption we're all navigating.
We'd certainly encourage you to take some time, maybe reflect on how these insights resonate with your own experiences. And if you found this intriguing, perhaps dive deeper into the full richness and detail of Lembke's book itself.
So, as you go about the rest of your day, maybe take a moment to mull this over. In a world constantly fighting for your attention, with an almost endless stream of rewards, which of these lessons of the balance really hits home for you right now? And perhaps more importantly, why? It's definitely something worth pondering.